Okay, what's going on? So I've got a thought experiment for you guys. Let's assume, as a part of this thought experiment, that it is true that our perception of reality is scalar, meaning there are different levels of perception based on the scale of existence that you reside on or in. And as a part of this system of perception, what we refer to as time is simply the scaffolding that structures the experience for awareness to perceive its existence. So that as a result, you would have something like a fly or a bee that lives a very short amount of time compared to us, say a few weeks or a month. From the perspective of our awareness, that is a very short amount of time. However, from the actual perspective of the fly or the bee, if you were to be inside that entity's body and experience its lifespan as you are currently experiencing your lifespan as a human being, as you are perceiving your awareness moment to moment, if you did that within the actual body of the fly or the bee, the idea behind scalar reality would be that that month would seem just as long as, say, 70 or 80 years seems from the perspective of our own awareness. In other words, it's only when you're viewing another scale from a certain level of awareness that you can perceive the difference in time. But when you're actually experiencing the moment itself and the succession of moments as they pass by, which we refer to as time, so again, it is not accurate to say that time does not exist, that time is an illusion. As a philosophical notion, yes, this is true in the sense of mechanical time and how it is measured. But realistically, there is a passage of moments. And this is time as an element of the reality that each and every awareness perceives. And taking it one step further, if we assume that this is the reality of the situation that we are in, then by default, this means that on one scale, your cells are aware. Your cells that make up your body would have an awareness very similar to your own current awareness and the awareness of, say, that fly or that bee. This would just be on a level further down the scales from where we currently reside. But if this is the reality of the situation, those cells themselves, that was a weird sentence, those cells would also be experiencing reality in the same way that our own awareness experiences reality. And as a result, they would be sentient. They would be conscious of their experience, and they might be experiencing a reality just as real as the reality that we perceive ourselves to be incarnated in. They might have an entire dream that they play out, not being aware consciously that they are actually just a cell in your body that makes you up. And you can take this metaphor and extend it to the potential situation that we might be in, to where we could be cells in a quote-unquote body that is larger that we are not consciously aware of. So assuming all of that as a part of a thought experiment, then let's go look for circumstantial evidence that would potentially support this hypothesis. And so, along those lines, here is an article every single cell in your body is controlled by its own circadian clock. This is from October of 2015. Early morning sluggishness, or the havoc wreaked by jet lag, it's all down to your circadian rhythm. But how does your biological timekeeping actually work? It turns out that nearly every cell in the human body keeps time by its own means. From your hair cells and skin to your muscles and even kidneys, there are trillions of cellular clocks everywhere in the body. In most organisms, the circadian rhythm has a roughly 24-hour period, thanks to the planet we've all evolved on. You know that your circadian rhythms respond to the cycle of light and dark, but that's only the external input. When it comes to translating a sunny morning into feeling alert, that input needs to be registered by the master clock in the brain. Here, in the hypothalamus, right above the crossing of your two optical nerves, lies a tiny patch of about 20,000 neurons called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. For a long time, it was thought this is where the biological clock is located. However, it turns out that the brain only contains the circadian rhythm central, from which hormonal signals travel all over the body, synchronizing the cells to the day-night cycle. Individual cells have their own little clocks that keep time locally, making sure enzymes are produced, blood pressure is under control, cells are dividing, and so on. Accordingly, you can see in the context of this thought experiment regarding the potential awareness of cells, well, it would make sense if each and every cell in your body is consciously aware in the same way that you are consciously aware, that they would have their own internal biological clock, as it were. Sure, they are connected to the central biological clock in the hypothalamus of the brain, which controls the larger body's own circadian rhythm and its cycle through day and night. But due to the structure of the body, it would make sense for the actual cells themselves to have their own little version of that biological clock for obvious reasons. I think this article eventually gets into it, but just think of your involuntary muscle contractions, like your heartbeat, for example. Your heart is beating without your conscious awareness. It just does it on its own. And so it would make sense for the cells that make up the heart to each have their own individual biological clock that is capable of synchronizing circadian rhythm outside of your conscious awareness. This biological timekeeping is actually a genetic process, and we share it with many bacteria, plants, animals, and even fungi. At a cellular level, we have a range of clock genes that code for clock proteins. Daily interactions between them causes protein level fluctuations in the cell, in turn influencing cell activity. Because the centralized clock keeps everything in sync, sometimes you get random bouts of hunger when jet-lagged, because the local stomach clock is disconnected from the brain for a few days until the whole system realigns again. And so here you see through the example of jet lag how the individual cells in the stomach are disconnected from the larger biological clock, and you receive these impulses which are expressed as hunger that otherwise would not be expressed in the time period that it is being expressed, because the body is out of sync in this way. And this is actually a great metaphor for what might be taking place with us currently. We are like the stomach cells of a body that is jet-lagged, out of sync with the larger biological clock, out of sync with the larger circadian rhythm of the scalar mind. Do you see what I mean? The Earth itself has its own circadian rhythm. It has its own pulse. We are out of sync as cells that are a part of the Earth's body. We are out of sync with its natural rhythm. And so you can see why a doctor would look at the situation, see what is taking place, and use a metaphor of cancer to describe what is going on. Because, yes, sure, the example of jet lag works, but you could take it another way to the area of disease and say, well, when the body is out of sync and it's manifested as a stomach tumor, the exact same thing is taking place. That cancer, each and every cell is disconnected from the larger system of the body. I mean, this is obviously the case because the cells are growing at the expense of the body itself. Those consciously aware cells in this scenario are out of control. They're so disconnected from the function of the body itself that they are destroying it. And this is a pretty accurate metaphor for what is taking place on the Earth right now. And the beauty of this metaphor is that it's as simple as the body, quote unquote, realigning again. It's as simple as those individual cells in the stomach realigning with the larger biological clock, the larger biological system, the larger scalar mind, coming into resonance with its natural design so that the system itself is healed eventually. And this can very easily take place on what we refer to as planet Earth. But the key, of course, is that if our perception of reality is scalar in nature, well, our perception of the passage of time, the succession of the moments of our awareness incarnated in this reality, well, the amount of time that it will take for us to realign in this reality with the larger system can seem like a very long time. I mean, maybe thousands of years. But from another scale, higher or adjacent to our own scale, it might seem like we view the time span of that fly or bee's life. It might be a week or a month to them. And when you take it all the way to the top, to the intelligence that manifested all of this, to the dreaming mind that created this system of scalar perception, all of this might be like 5 seconds to it. Which is, it's all very awe-inspiring and mind-blowing when you think about the potential here and what we really might be experiencing and be a part of. It's quite amazing. But moving on. Almost every cell in our body has a circadian clock. Salk Institute circadian researcher Sachin Panda told Veronique Greenwood at Quantum Magazine, Sachin Panda, that's an interesting name. It helps every cell figure out when to use energy, when to rest, when to repair DNA, or to replicate DNA. One vivid example is hair cells. In 2013, Panda and his colleagues discovered that mouse hair grows fast in the morning and slows down at night, when it repairs cell damage instead. They hypothesized that this has real implications for cancer patients who receive radiotherapy. If they are treated in the morning, that's when cells are not repairing, which leads to hair loss. While we don't yet know if human hair follows that same clock we found in mice hair, it is true that facial hair in men grows during the day, resulting in the proverbial 5 o'clock shadow. There is no 5 a.m. shadow if you shave at night. Just real quick, incidentally, this lends a little credence to the idea of not eating food past a certain time at night because your body is potentially in repair mode. And when you eat, your body has to give energy to the digestion process, which takes away from the repair process. And I have difficulties with this myself because I like to snack late at night, and it's a very difficult habit to break. But I just wanted to throw that out there because it's kind of related to this this example that's being used here regarding hair cells and the 5 o'clock shadow. There are other uses for our knowledge of clock genes. Some of them regulate cell death and proliferation, two processes that are disrupted in cancer tissue, where clock genes and proteins don't seem to be present. Well, how very interesting, right, that they just come out and say this, going back to what I was referring to just a little bit ago about the disconnection being quote-unquote cancer. Well, they're saying right here, two processes that are disrupted in cancer tissue as far as the biological clock goes. Well, some of those clock genes regulate cell death and proliferation, and they're telling you, hey, when this is disrupted, a disconnection occurs and it can manifest as quote-unquote cancer. Studying our cellular clocks can also help us understand how to align hormonal medication to patients' circadian rhythm. Oh, and just thinking of that, what I was going into in the Black Mirror video about what this technology and the electromagnetic fields and all of the Wi-Fi networks are doing to us, well, I was referring to how the editing was potentially serving as a form of time dilation, the way it was altering our perception in the moment when viewing music videos or YouTube videos or whatever the case may be, just being on these devices all of the time, and how that might have contributed to the ADD or ADHD phenomenon that was experienced by children, just as this technology was really taking hold on the collective mind. Well, it's also explained another way as disrupting your circadian rhythm, and I was getting into that, how when you're on the computer for a long time, it can be difficult to fall asleep, and it disrupts your day-night cycle. And as this is explaining here, you know, when your clock genes are messed with in that way, the individual cells can become disconnected, and this can manifest as many different health problems in the larger body. So that's a whole nother angle to what's going on here. But anyway, where was I? Studying our cellular clocks can also help us understand how to align hormonal medication to a patient's circadian rhythm, the best ways to treat jet lag or sleep disorders, and even explain why older people have disrupted sleep patterns. It could be that their central clock gets out of sync with the rest of the body. And that would be exactly what's taking place with the internet and the computers and the phones, right? Because your central clock, that hypothalamus, well, that was a play on words there that was accidental, but yes, the hypothalamus, it turns your hypothalamus into a hyperthalamus. It speeds up your perception of time because you're so stimulated through the dopamine responses that social media has been crafted to produce. And so that central clock in your brain gets out of sync with the rest of the body, and then you can't fall asleep because your mind is racing, and it's out of sync with the rest of the body. So let's see, the last sentence here. Cellular clocks are nearly everywhere for a good reason. Without these little genetic mechanisms, your body would be a hot mess. And this has wide-ranging implications, right? You know, just getting into the placebo effect, that's what the placebo effect is a manifestation of. It's a manifestation of your mind communicating with your consciously aware cells to produce a healing result that otherwise has no basis in reality. This is what we are all missing. We are missing the awareness of your cells. They are consciously aware just like you are, and if you are in a state of being where that communication is allowed to take place, you can produce what many would refer to as magical results. You can produce miracles when that cellular communication is one resonant frequency in symbiosis with itself. And that's just referring to how it can take place with the cells in your body and your awareness. Well, now extend that metaphor in a scalar way to the larger mind that each and every human being is connected to as cells to a larger body, and imagine what we would be capable of if we were all resonating with the same frequency, as it were. And so it's interesting along those lines, you know, look at what they've done with the English language. They've taken this idea and they called the phones cellular phones. They called it a cellular communication network. And what is it really representing? Well, it's a device in your hand that is connected to every other device in every other person's hands, which pretty much everyone has at this point. And there is a network that allows you to communicate with everyone. And so it's replicating this process that is exemplified by your own cells and your awareness, as well as the larger way that each and every one of us could connect with one another. And you take that one step further to the terminology in prisons, where they say that the inmates are in prison cells. And what are the cells' dimensions? Well, usually they are 6 by 9, the yin and the yang, the Cancer constellation. You see? And indeed, prisons are their own worlds. They have their own set of rules and their own systems, to the point where it's like a body. And each and every person is in their individual cell and has their own internal clocks, but they are controlled by the larger clock, which is the prison guidelines, the prison rules that cannot be broken. And so it's a metaphor to the body in that way. But of course, as usual with the language, they turn it into something that is not very inspiring. And, you know, indeed, going even further, it's a manifestation of the actual quote-unquote disconnection, or the quote-unquote cancer that is taking place on the larger scale on the planet, where this system produces so much lack of abundance that there is a whole scheme in place to send fractals of awareness into this cell where they are trapped as a outward manifestation of disease. The whole thing is pretty wild, right? But moving on to a different article, scientists discover signaling circuit boards inside body cells. Cells in the body are wired like computer chips to direct signals that instruct how they function, research suggests. Unlike a fixed circuit board, however, cells can rapidly rewire their communication networks to change their behavior. The discovery of this cell-wide web turns our understanding of how instructions spread around a cell on its head. It was thought that the various organs and structures inside a cell float around in an open sea called the cytoplasm. Signals that tell the cell what to do were thought to be transmitted in waves, and the frequency of the waves was the crucial part of the message. Researchers at the University of Edinburgh found information is carried across a web of guide wires that transmit signals across tiny nanoscale distances. It is the movement of charged molecules across these tiny distances that transmit information, just as in a computer microprocessor, the researchers say. These localized signals are responsible for orchestrating the cell's activities, such as instructing muscle cells to relax or contract. When these signals reach the genetic material at the heart of the cell, called the nucleus, they instruct minute changes in structure that release specific genes so that they can be expressed. These changes in gene expression further alter the behavior of the cell. Researchers say understanding the code that controls this wiring system could help understand diseases, such as pulmonary hypertension and cancer, and can one day open up new treatment opportunities. The team made their discovery by studying the movement of charged calcium molecules inside cells, which are the key messages that carry instructions inside cells. Using high-powered microscopes, they were able to observe the wiring network with the help of computing techniques similar to those that enabled the first ever image of a black hole to be obtained. Scientists say their findings are an example of quantum biology, an emerging field that uses quantum mechanics and theoretical chemistry to solve biological problems. Professor Mark Evans said, "We found that cell function is coordinated by a network of nanotubes similar to the carbon nanotubes you find in a computer microprocessor." The most striking thing is that this circuit is highly flexible, as this cell-wide web can rapidly reconfigure to deliver different outputs in a manner determined by the information received by and relayed from the nucleus. This is something no human-made microprocessors or circuit boards are yet capable of achieving. Well, at least that's what they tell us publicly. I mean, we really don't know how far advanced artificial awareness systems are, but what they are describing here is how an artificial system would function. They are trying to replicate human awareness in a quote-unquote machine. And that's why they are making the analogy here to a circuit board when observing the cells. The key, though, is what Professor Evans says here. The most striking thing is that this circuit is highly flexible, as this cell-wide web can rapidly reconfigure to deliver different outputs in a manner determined by the information received by and relayed from the nucleus. In other words, what these scientists are observing through their research is awareness. They're observing the conscious awareness of the cell. And so it's not fixed like a computer circuit board is, this cell-wide web as they refer to it, the communication that's taking place through the carbon nanotubes, or at least that's how they made a metaphor to what was going on, what they were observing. But they're kind of baffled by how the communication in the cell allows it to instantly reconfigure in real time. And they're observing it after the fact through their imaging technology and trying to do the whole Cartesian thing where it's a machine and they're trying to deconstruct the levers of the machine and how it's put together and reverse engineer it, but they're missing the part where what you're observing is conscious awareness. The cell is consciously aware and you have just observed it. And this is what all of science is missing. At least if you go with the thought experiment that we've been exploring here about scalar reality and our scalar perception, which is a function of the scale of awareness that you are currently placed in. And from our perspective, we look at the activity of these cells and they don't see what is really taking place. They don't see the conscious awareness of the cell itself.